Okay, for the last lecture on the respiratory system, we're going to look at regulation of the respiratory system. And we'll start with all of the incoming information that is used to determine how deeply you breathe and how frequently you breathe. And then we'll finish up by looking at how we send the information back out. Okay, primary respiratory regulation is going to be done here in the brain stem. Remember, we've got the midbrain, pons, and medulla all making a part of the brain stem. And then just so you can see where everything else is, here's the cerebellum and here's the cerebrum up at the top. The biggest player in the regulation of respiration is the inspiratory nuclei. They are located on the backside, the dorsal side of the medulla. And most things feed into this branch in one area or another. This is the rhythmicity center. That means it controls how frequently you breathe in or out. To send the signal, the nerves are going to switch over to the front side of the uh, spinal cord and be delivered to their final targets. And basically, the way it works is during just normal resting respiration, it will send the message out in like a 2 second burst. So it will fire for 2 seconds and cause a contraction and then relax. Right in front of that, in the ventral surface of the medulla, is the ventral respiratory nuclei. This is responsible for exhalation. Now, normally it has a very easy job because normal exhalation requires no work at all. Your chest wall is elastic. So you breathe in, and then all you have to do is relax everything to breathe out because as the elastic means you stretch it, and then it goes back to where it was before. As it just goes back to where it was before, it pushes everything out that you need to be pushed out. Now, if you need forced expiration, forced expiration, the ventral respiratory nuclei will also stimulate um, the internal intercostals and the abdominal muscles to push air out faster so that because your respiratory rate's fast enough that waiting for the elasticity is too long. And by the way, that's why if you're jogging and you get a crick in your stomach or your side, a stitch in your side, as they say, uh, that's why, because you are using muscles that you're not used to using that don't have the advanced circulation that you would have if you use them more frequently. And so they start going into anaerobic respiration and building up lactic acid, and you can feel that, and it's very uncomfortable. This also helps you with forced inhalation. When you are not being able to inhale um, with the primary inhalation muscles, which are the diaphragm and the external intercostals, you will also enlist the aid of the sternocleidomastoid up in the neck. For normal inspiration, what happens is you innervate the diaphragm. Looks like I'm going to switch the order after all. And the diaphragm drops and pulls down. At the same time, the external intercostals contract and pull up. And that creates a vacuum there in the center when you do that. And there's only one way for anything to come in when you create that vacuum, and that's through the trachea. So air gets sucked down into your lungs. If that is insufficient, then you will also employ your sternocleidomastoid muscles to pull up with your ribs. And so that's a really telltale sign. If you go in and you see the patient's neck muscles standing out when they breathe in, then you know that they are having to forcefully um, pull that air in. And since I'm already talking about now the outgoing signal, I'll go ahead and tell you that the intercostal muscles are innervated by the spinal nerves that come out in between the vertebrae, T1 through 11. These nerves come out and they run on the bottom side of the rib. So here's our internal intercostals, and we use those during forced expiration. Again, during normal expiration, we don't need them at all. And here are the external intercostals, and those are used every time that you breathe in. because this nerve runs along the bottom side of a rib, if you needed to do a thoracocentesis, boy, I had trouble with that one. You do it on the top side of the rib, and when you would do that would be like if you were inserting a chest tube, for example, to um, reinflate a collapsed lung. They will feel along and make sure that they do it on the top part of the rib so that you don't impact the nerve that's innervating those ribs. Okay, there's two other areas. These are up in the pons. The pneumataxic area is in the upper pons, and it works with the inspiratory nuclei, um, and it's what more or less shuts down the signal. The inspiratory nucleus is going to send out those 2-second bursts. The pneumataxic area is going to send the signal down that after 2 seconds it says, stop that. Stimulation of this area will increase the frequency. And one of the things that does that is muscle activity, and we'll look at that in just a second. The apneustic area is just below this. This makes inhalation longer and deeper, and it more or less balances out the pneumataxic area. But they in turn send messages down to the inspiratory nuclei. Again, that's the main player. So, what are the things that can influence the inspiratory nuclei? This is a lot. Think of this as kind of like being the SA node in the heart. The SA node, left alone, is going to do its own signal. But as we know from studying cardiac output, lots of things can tell the SA node to speed up or slow down. And the same is true about the inspiratory nuclei inside the medulla. Okay, one of the major regulatory centers is found in the blood vessels coming right off the top of the heart. Here's the heart right here. Here's the aortic semilunar valve, and here's the aorta. In the aorta itself are chemoreceptors for oxygen. They are going to carry information via cranial nerve number 10, that is the vagus nerve, if you've forgotten your cranial nerves, back up to the inspiratory nuclei center. And anytime your oxygen levels start to drop, they're going to stimulate your inspiratory nuclei and say, hey, we need to do something about that. And there are 3 branches that come off of the aorta, off the top arc: the brachiocephalic, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian. The first 2 are going to come up and eventually become the internal and external carotids. I will point out, although it's not part of this lecture, that the carotid sinuses are located on the internal carotids, and they are pressure receptors, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about the kidneys. In between the 2 is an area called the carotid bodies, and it has a little blood vessel that feeds off there, and this is another place that contains oxygen centers. These are probably more significant than the chemoreceptors in the aortic arch. They also respond to carbon dioxide levels and hydrogen ion levels, and they carry messages back when there's low oxygen through cranial nerve number 9, and that's the glossopharyngeal if you've forgotten that one, back to the inspiratory center. So right as blood is coming out of the heart, and this is, remember, this is before blood is going to the body. It's down there in the left atrium, and now we're going to, the left ventricle. Blood comes back to the heart from the lungs into the left atrium, then down to the left ventricle. Then the left ventricle is going to contract and send it out to the body. So very early on, we're measuring oxygen levels there in the arch. And where is it most important? Because it cannot undergo any type of anaerobic respiration, your brain. So it's critical that your brain be getting an oxygen supply. So of course we're going to monitor the amount of the amount of oxygen going up into our brain. Okay. And amazingly, this is stone cold sober. It just cannot talk tonight. Okay, let's look at skeletal muscle, which is voluntary muscle. Okay, there are stretch receptors here in the muscle that can detect the frequency of the contraction. As you begin to use a muscle, and before your muscle becomes oxygen starved, the proprioceptors also send a message to the inspiratory nuclei to say, hey, we are starting to use these muscles. Another message is coming from the voluntary control portions of your cerebrum. They start sending messages down to the inspiratory nuclei saying, hey, we're starting to use these muscles. Let's step it up. Let's not wait until we have a big oxygen demand. Also, any buildup of hydrogen ions, which is, of course, acidosis, also stimulates this respiratory nuclei to increase respiration. And we talked about that on the last time when we talked about how we use this to help control blood pH. And finally, the limbic system, which is your emotional centers of your brain, and it's involuntary. If I scare you, for example, I'm going to stimulate your limbic system, which is going to come down here into the diencephalon. Actually, it'll start here in the thalamus. That's where you receive the stimulus. Then it'll be processed through the cerebrum as well, and the diencephalon, which is your hypothalamus and thalamus, predominantly your hypothalamus, and that's your autonomic centers, and that's going to speed up your respiration. Now, the last thing that I need to tell you here is the big primary muscle for inspiration is, of course, the diaphragm. It's going to be found right at the bottom part of the thoracic cavity, right before you go into the abdominal cavity. Stimulation here will cause the diaphragm to drop, as we said before. And the nerve that does that is called the phrenic nerve. It comes out of the cervical nerves C3, C4, and C5. And the little catchphrase to remember that one by is C3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. What that means is if you have a break above that in the spinal cord, you shut off the respiratory center, and that is that, as they say. An example of, and remember the intercostals are innervated even lower. They start at T1. So anything above C3, and that's that. This happened to the famous race car driver Dale Earnhardt, who had a wreck that caused his neck to snap forward fast enough that it ruptured the spinal cord up in the top part, and so he lost consciousness, I'm sure, almost immediately, and then had no chance to recover because he had no ability to innervate the inspiratory muscles to supply the oxygen to his brain. So there's the big picture of regulatory function for the respiratory system, for the signals coming in, the signals going out, and the specific parts here in the brainstem that control the whole process.